Good morning, and welcome to the September briefing on getting started on the path to zero trust. I am Joyce Hunter, Executive Director for the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, or ICIT as it is better known. ICIT is the nation's leading cybersecurity think tank, providing objective, nonpartisan research, advisory, and education to legislative, commercial, and public sector cybersecurity stakeholders. We are honored to be a conduit between honest experts and agency and legislative and critical infrastructure leaders in need of knowledge. I want to thank Fireman and DLT for sponsoring this briefing and our audience for your participation. Let's be serious. No need to belabor the point. We all know that trying to defend the network perimeter is a bit futile in today's mobile and cloud-first world. So obvious question is what's next? Zero trust isn't a new concept, although it has certainly gained popularity after numerous high-profile security incidents and executive order on cybersecurity issued by the White House this past May. With the implementation plan well underway, our panelists will discuss and evaluate current zero trust architecture utilization and opportunities for sharing of best practices. This virtual briefing will provide pragmatic suggestions to address these challenges using tools and services available today that could get an organization on a path to a zero trust future. Our panelists are Lieutenant Commander Ian Simon, Information Warfare Training Command Corey Station, Don McLean, ICIT Fellow and Chief Security Strategist at DLT, Reggie Best, President and Chief Product Officer at Fireman, Major Stephen Whittam, West Point Military Academy, and I'm your moderator, Joyce Hunter. So let's start with a basic question for all of our panelists. Describe a zero trust mindset. Why does this matter when planning your zero trust strategy? And what problems is zero trust trying to solve? You could take all of the questions, one of the questions, or, and so we will start with Steve.
Thanks, Joyce. Thanks, everybody. Really glad to be here. When we talk about zero trust, I think the first thing, the definitions themselves, just in the terms, matter, right? The traditional security model, you call it perimeter security. You may have heard it likened to the moat and castle analogy. Essentially, trusts implicitly anybody who gains access to the main door. And the zero trust model breaks that paradigm by saying the internal network is no more secure than the external network. We are no longer going to implicitly trust anyone who has proven enough to get in the front gate. Instead, now we have gates in front of all of the doors that are inside the castle as well. So you have to prove over and over your need for resources in order to get access to what you need to work. So instead of getting access to the network, being given a certain user level privilege, and being given access to anything and everything that level of privilege gives you access to, for example, the network administrator, you now have access only to what you as a unique individual and your unique device has access to based on the restrictions set in place by the network administrator on a per resource level. So you are essentially taking your internal network and trusting it just as much, read none, as your external network. And therein lies the way that the word zero trust comes into play. You may hear also terms like, we're going to assume that each user and each process inside the network is compromised. There are technologies that allow you to do this to an extent, but really where you're talking about deployment and the security model, really you're looking at limited access, trust only enough to give the users what they need to do their job, or the processes to do their job, before you get to a point where you're expecting each user and process to be compromised.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Ian.
Good morning, and thank you. Yeah, so I'd like to first say, yeah, I agree with what Steve is saying. I'll refer to a document from NSA they published in February, and it's a public cybersecurity information document. And they explicitly address the zero trust mindset, and I think it nests well with the NIST special publication on zero trust architecture. And they outline a few basic tenets, which Steve talked about: never trust, always verify. You assume breaches or malicious activity already on the network, and you explicitly verify all access to resources on the network. And I think a key part of that is you need to really define what functions and resources are performed on an organization's network that are critical to mission success. And so the one document refers to your data, your assets, your applications and services. NIST simply defines those as the resources, which may be any system, data, or application. And I think that's something that we sometimes forget about, is we really need to understand what are we trying to do on our network and define it down to greater granularity than just setting up that perimeter around what we call our network. And so I think that helps address some of the current landscape, which you talked about, Joyce, which is the reliance on cloud-based services and then policies that organizations have grown to adapt, such as teleworking and bring your own device policies.
Great. Reggie.
Good morning, Reggie Best from Fireman. Look, I think some of the comments that have been made have been fabulous in terms of the mindset that we think customers or potential customers should have about zero trust architectures. You're going from a situation where folks have had sort of free reign of their kind of network infrastructure. That's what networks were designed to do. It was designed to connect computers and people and their information, and all of the basic technologies were sort of developed with that in mind. And so there's a fundamental sort of shift that's occurring to sort of rein that in and to control that and to leverage policy and to manage that policy. And, as Steve mentioned, there's going to be a lot more doors. There's going to be a lot more policy enforcement points within that environment that now, need to be managed. So I think that there are some foundational elements that you've got to bring to bear. This is going to be a multi-year journey for a lot of organizations, but you've got to get started somewhere. And the discussions that we have, we think it's very important to start with a foundation of understanding what your network really is. What do you have? What is its topology? How is it connecting to resources like the cloud and other infrastructure? Number one, and understand and keep that fresh and up to date in real time as much as possible. Number two, you have to have visibility and situational awareness of the policies from the individual enforcement points within that environment, and how does that all roll together into a enterprise or organization-wide governance kind of model, for your policies. Those are fundamental foundational aspects that we think will lend itself towards that migration, that mindset of zero trust, where you're going from, this wide open landscape to one that's much more tightly and rigorously controlled and a much more granular basis. And, that's where we think you have to start from a mindset perspective.
Thank you, Reggie. Don.
Sure. Well, my co-panelists have described the mindset very well, so I don't want to repeat what they say. I'm going to attack the other piece of your question, which is what problems does zero trust seek to solve? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of traction around zero trust. OMB and CISA just published new documents on zero trust, which I haven't had time to digest in full yet. But the first step I feel is to look at what problems you're trying to solve. Maybe that's because I'm an old, engineering background. You got to state the problem. Einstein famously said that if he had an hour to save the world, he'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes, actually enacting the solution. So as we've said, problem number one is the disappearing perimeter. I remember when I used to do assessment work for the government, step one would be to define a system boundary, and that was a physical boundary. You know, we'd find the point of presence. Here's the place where we plug in, and that connects to the outside world, and that's where our responsibility ends. Well, with the advent of cloud computing and the dispersion of the workforce due to COVID, the notion of a physical perimeter has certainly disappeared. So if there is anything such as a perimeter, it's more a scope of responsibility now rather than a physical boundary. Commensurate with the disappearing perimeter is that the attack surface is growing. Instead of just everything that you need to cover, that you need to protect being inside one building, well, now your attack surface might be at a cloud service provider somewhere and in people's homes. Who knows what Wi-Fi protections people have in their house, and whose children are playing on the computer when you're not looking, and that sort of thing. The other thing too is to recognize that intrusions are inevitable. We were talking just before the break, or just before the webinar started, about the intrusion at Howard University, and also at the ransomware that is attacking elementary schools of all things. And we could go on, but I think we've all seen enough reports of intrusions to recognize that intrusions, if they haven't happened yet, are highly likely at best and almost inevitable. So consequently, we need to be prepared with response plans, preferably automated response plans, so that you can, you have something that can respond when you're asleep at night at 4 in the morning or whatever. Although I think Joyce gets up early. You get up at like 4. But all right, when normal people are asleep at 4 in the morning. And then also recognize that we're also trying to solve the problem of long dwell times and lateral movement within your network. If the perimeter is disappearing and your internal quote unquote internal network is just as vulnerable as the internet, well, the lateral movement becomes that much easier, and dwell times are likely to be longer. So I would say the problems are disappearing perimeter, growing attack surface, inevitable intrusions, and the long dwell times associated with lateral movement.
Thank you, Don. I believe that for a lot of organizations, they believe that they are insulated. Educational institutions, I've always thought that they were insulated from the real world. And I think it's not a matter of if anymore, it's a matter of when. Because it will happen. It's a matter, and it's a matter of how pervasive it is in your organization. Reggie, I want to come back to you. There's an influx of potential zero trust vendors and products in the market. Why should the private sector, not government contractors, but private sector individuals, implement zero trust now rather than waiting for an all-in-one solution?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, look, there's always going to be new products and new capabilities that purport to, address a need in the market, and I think that that's fabulous. With that said, however, I don't think that, zero trust is something that you have to wait for, nor do I think it's something that any single vendor is really going to be able to encompass in one solution. There's already a ton of policy enforcement point infrastructure that's out there. There's already a bunch of network infrastructure. There's new offerings like SD-WAN and SDN, SASE, and other infrastructures that are being brought to bear. And all of this needs to be, managed. I think that most of the solutions, if not all of them, are going to be sort of multi-vendor in nature. And as I said at the outset, there are some foundational things that most organizations could do today to get the ball rolling around, zero trust. Understanding what you have, creating your kind of zones, what it should be able to communicate with what within that framework, to begin to sort of tamp down on that free reign kind of concept that I mentioned was sort of the basis of networks, certainly within an organization or within an enterprise. And how can you begin to get visibility to that topology, to those networks, and also to the policies and how those are meeting your governance framework. There's going to be lots and lots of different infrastructure out there. You can get started now with the tools that are available in the marketplace now. And yeah, there are going to be other vendors that have interesting twists or turns that, you know, might simplify it, that might, you know, drive adoption, might make it easier. But I don't think that, you know, it's something that organizations really have the ability or that they should wait for, because this is a pressing need. I
Mhm.
mean, as these various breaches and intrusions, you know, we need to get our arms around this stuff as quickly as possible. And waiting for a silver bullet, I just think is, you know, a little bit far-fetched.
I'm going to follow up on that a little bit, Reggie. Do you think that the rapid eye movement that's going on in industry now, do you think that's because they are waiting for an all-in-one solution, or is it just so such a big elephant that they don't know where to start?
I mean, most of the clients that we talk to, and you know, I talk to a lot of federal agencies trying to translate sort of their needs into product features and capabilities that might be helpful. There's generally an understanding, you know, at the management level and at C level, you know, within these organizations that, you know, it's not going to be a silver bullet. You know,
Mm.
they're going to work with multiple vendors. They've got a lot of infrastructure already. There's probably going to be systems integrators that need to help them piece things together in various parts of their organization. So I do think that there is definitely an understanding at the management level that, you know, this is not something that we have to wait for, that there's not going to be some, you know, sort of single answer. You know, certainly with the people that we talk to. So I think that the rapid eye movement that you refer to is related to more of the gargantuan nature of the
Mm.
challenge and the fear factor or the concern factor about, well, where do we get started? And I think that's one of the reasons for this panel and some of the other materials and content of, you know, kind of giving a maturity model, showing, you know, how you can get started, what are the steps that you can begin to take in order to kind of implement this mindset within your organization, sort of starting at a piece of at the time and then sort of rolling it out as you get more and more confidence with it.
Okay, thank you, Reggie. Don, building on what Reggie said, what considerations should go into choosing a deployment model?
Well, I think the first step would be to look at what the deployment models are. And there are several models out there, and both CISA and OMB now have thrown their hats into the ring as well. As I said, those are just brand spanking new, so I can't really speak to them in any detail right now. But I think if for government customers, probably the most widely applicable document is one that I think Ian or Steve, I forget who mentioned, which is the NIST 800-207, which is the document from NIST that describes zero trust architecture. And one of the things that I like about that document is that it's relatively straightforward. It's only about 37 pages. And it's not all that dense, even though it comes from, you know, an agency kind of known for, you know, bureaucratic language and stuff. And it also simplifies, as was mentioned before, the whole outlook into resources. Everything is just considered a resource, whether it's a human being, a piece, traffic on the network, computing power, whatever, or data or storage. It's all just resources. Then that provides a nice unified way of looking at things. That said, there's also documentation from NSA, though that is very broad, short and high level, which is nice, but it doesn't go into much detail. And the DoD wins the contest for the longest document. They published a 170-page reference, but fear not, much of that is just kind of dictionary reference material. The guts of that is only about similar in length to the NIST model. It's about 30 or 40 pages long, and also very, very good and comprehensive. And then, you know, now we've also got CISA weighing in, OMB as well, and there's also commercial frameworks, the Forrester network. The Forrester framework is actually something I'm certified in, et cetera. What I've discovered in reviewing these is that they often they use different terminology, but they often essentially say the same thing. They're trying to solve the same problems, and they're trying to evaluate, and they're trying to implement solutions in much the same way. My approach would be to pick one of these models. If you're DoD, you probably want to pick the DoD reference model. If you're in the IC, you would probably pick the NSA model. If you're in FedCiv, the CIS documentation is probably going to be the most applicable. But they're not all going to be that different. I mean, I haven't read the new CISA document yet, but I'm going to guess. I'll venture a guess. I'll go out on a limb and say it's probably not all that different. What you want to do really is as Reggie was saying, tie these abstractions. Pick a model and run with it, and then the real guts of it is tying those abstractions and frameworks to specific products or technologies. What are you gonna buy to implement identity management? How are you gonna get data encryption? Do you have technology in place already that does these things? How are you going to approach automating incident response? Do you have if you've got a good manual response framework in place already, automating that is going to be that much easier. If you don't have a good incident response in place, and I have a relative who works at a government agency that was hit, and she was complaining bitterly to me about the lack of response plan at that agency. I won't say which one it was, but if you don't have anything that's manual that works, you certainly can't automate it very well. So that what I would say is pick the model that is appropriate to your agency or your area of government, whether it's DoD, IC, or Federal Civilian, or SLED, and run with it. And then I would say, work towards tying specific technologies and products to the frameworks, and recognize you might already have some stuff in place that works, and then maybe you just need to enforce it or use it more stringently.
Thank you. But Don, does the model selection change based on IoT or BYOD devices in the network?
Well, I think the model is, the thing about Zero Trust is it's very broad and very comprehensive. So I'm not sure that it changes all that much. Your selection of technology and your acknowledgement of what's happening with those technologies is going to change. So I think the basic approach and philosophy of Zero Trust is not going to be fundamentally different for IoT or BYOD devices. Okay. The technologies that you use might be different, and the implementation might be more difficult because IoT in particular is notoriously difficult to secure. SpaceX and Richard Branson notwithstanding, it's not going to be that easy to fly up to a satellite and change out a chip or a hard drive.
We're not a Star Trek yet, right?
Right.
Ian, what 3 things would you recommend to begin implementing Zero Trust?
So I think anytime you want to implement some new strategy, especially when it comes to making decisions such as to buy products, I think first you need to educate. And you need to educate the entire workforce within an organization, but particularly the leaders of an organization. And I think the value of that is it can result in a drastic change in policy that then has a cascading effect on what the overall strategy is and ultimately what products or vendors you want to use. For example, maybe it's not an appropriate decision for an organization to allow bring your own devices. Due to what's happened in the past year, maybe it was just a immediate response to what was going on and allowed for remote teleworking and things like that. More education may lead to saying, hey, I'm not going to allow anyone to work from home, but maybe I will lease remote office spaces for a concentration of workers to go to, and then I can implement a stronger policy on the infrastructure there. So I think that's critical before you implement further. Next, I think it's really critical that you inspect and evaluate one's own organizational network. We talked about it a little bit before, but you really have to define what are your critical functions. What are you doing on your network? Do you know why you need various functions on your network? And then maybe you can scale it down, or maybe you need to be realistic that you can't scale it down. The tasks involved with that of simply enumerating devices and products already in use on a network, that can be very, very challenging. Do you have accurate and up-to-date user lists? Do you know legacy systems that are on it? When it comes to the DoD, it's very, I think, widely known that there's well-defined requirements for places like U.S. Cyber Command to defend the DoD's information networks. So the question becomes, what is considered a DoD information network? You have other things that go on, such as not just what is part of the DoD, but then when you talk about the defense industrial base, so you have a second critical infrastructure. If you have a trusted relationship with some of those contractors, what is under your purview of your network defense? What do you have to do? So I think, again, you just really need to understand your own network and what you're doing on that network and who you're allowing to use your network. Thirdly, let's say budget, and I don't just mean financially, but the times and the other resources. For example, going back to that NIST special publication, it talks about data sources that support zero trust architecture, and they're going to add costs in one form or another. So the cost of a threat intelligence feed. So maybe you're paying for subscription service. That's great. Those are needed, but who's reading it? Who's reacting to it? And then who is going to develop or implement a mitigation for those indications of compromise and things of that sort? You need to devote time. They also talk about things like your network and system activity logs. That's a key piece that's talked about in a lot of the documentation thing. It even goes back to the executive order 14028 that recently came out that really talks about zero trust architecture. And it says, yeah, you need to keep logs. Okay, you keep logs. Who can read them? When are they going to read them? Is it going to be the same person in your workforce that's responsible for going and fixing the email or responding to trouble tickets? So are you going to reallocate and reprioritize the responsibilities and requirements of the current workforce, or are you going to budget to hire more to respond if needed? So it can either change those priority responsibilities, or it can say, hey, I need more people. So again, it goes back to the three things, I think, which are start with education, look at your network and really understand it and the functions it performs, and then budget your time and resources appropriately for the implementation.
Joyce, you're frozen there and we can't hear you.
Thank you, Ian. Oh, I am? Uh-oh.
You're back. You're back.
Am I okay now?
You're okay now.
Okay, good. Okay, great. Thank you, Ian. Because when you're talking about the resources and you're talking about getting leadership on board, I think that's the biggest challenge, right? I mean, getting leadership on board so that the resources can be deployed for some kind of action. Steve, why don't we go to you and talk about getting leadership on board? What are some of the ways that you have seen to be successful in convincing leadership that this is a serious problem and we need to devote more of the budget, whether it's commercial or federal budget, to zero trust in cybersecurity?
Sure. Well, I think some of that's already happening just by virtue of the number of high-profile attacks that have been ongoing. Leaders across the country, across the world, at all levels, whether federal or commercial, are beginning to understand more and more how vulnerable and more importantly, I think, how expensive the breaches can be. You know, leadership really, their primary job at the C-suite level is risk management. And so when they're looking at, and you talk about the rapid eye movement and companies or leaders looking for solutions, what they're really looking to do is properly manage that risk. Can I give that to another organization that has potentially a better technological workforce to handle that system for me? But a lot of what Reggie said, I think, really needs to be restated. The mindset is really the key here. There will never be a silver bullet to this problem. It's always going to be a leadership, risk management problem. It's going to be a cultural and operational problem, and it's going to be an end user employee integration in with that culture problem on top of the technical solutions. So when you talk about getting leader buy-in, the first thing to do is to discuss it in terms of risk. You can talk cyber insurance all you like, but until those rulings come down as to whether or not the NotPetya attack is going to be paid for, because the war exclusion clause makes it a dicey legal issue whether or not the insurance company even has to pay out. You can't offload that risk right now. You can't offload it in a purely technical sense, and you can't offload it in a purely cost sense. You're going to have to integrate that into your operations. You're going to have to manage that at a leader level. So I would start there. I would start with discussing it in terms of risk. But then I think when you go back to what Ian said about identifying those critical functions, when you start looking at deployment models or maturity models or what have you, you always have to take stock of what you have. And so when you identify those critical functions, there's a really interesting outage for the cloud platform AWS, where an individual engineer fat-fingered an extra 0 on a shutdown routine, and 10 times the number of virtual machines that were servicing their cloud business went down at the time than should have been. And that caused a month-long disruption and a lot of headache for Amazon as they tried to bring those services back up for all of the companies that were paying them for their cloud infrastructure. So take those opportunities. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. When you get an opportunity to evaluate like industries and talk about the ways in which things that they didn't expect to cause problems were very expensive problems in the end, you can begin to form that risk management framework for your particular operations. The other thing to talk to leaders about is the fact that it really is their buy-in that's going to make this happen, because the policy decisions, the resource allocation, and the top-down enforcement and pushing through of any migration to a zero trust system, it's really going to be on the leadership. So that's really how I would approach talking to them, is to speak to the leaders in their language. I think security professionals have done the operational and leadership side of business a disservice by saying the sky is falling and calling, there are threats everywhere. Well, that's great, but I, as the C-suite, the CEO, you can't just tell me that the sky is falling and there are bombs outside of every door, right? You have to tell me what's credible, and you have to tell me what I can do. And I think if we're really going to approach leaders, we need to speak their language and speak to them on a level that they care about. And I think it starts with that risk management.
Great, thank you. So let's and this is the question for both Ian and Steve. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. We've all heard that. So now we've taken care of the leaders, and we know that the leaders is one of the tenets on beginning to implement zero trust. But then let's talk about the end user. How do you get somebody from clicking on all those self-running tests that you have to take every year, and most people just kind of breeze through it and not pay any attention to it? How do you really get the worker, the people who are sitting there every single day, not to click on a link and to pay attention before they actually answer an email?
I think you need to do two things, which is, and something we've seen recently. Sometimes you make it so the link can't work and you can't click on it, and you add a technology piece to it if it's appropriate and if it's worth the overhead cost to do so. Other thing is kind of what Steve was talking about. When it comes to some of the issues I think we've had in the past, it comes to, do we have a good lexicon so that we speak the normal speak to people? Oftentimes when you talk about from kind of a military perspective, you talk about cyber operations. One of the challenges has been developing joint publications that talk about it in conventional military operational terms. We can't say this is entirely different. So when you talk about it as an organization, it can't be the nerdy, geeky stuff about, all these terms that don't mean anything to the general audience. It needs to be understood that this is just part of the functionality of an organization. In a modern age, when we talk about cloud-based services and things like that, people generally understand that. So you just talk to them about what goes on. I think Steve talked well about, just talk to them honestly about what the threats are. And you don't have to use peculiar terms that the general person doesn't understand. I think it does help that you can refer to higher level documentation. You can always kind of convince people that, hey, if the bosses are prioritizing this, then it probably behooves the rest of us worker bees to get on board with some of it if it seems to make sense, and it does. So when you refer to, especially in government, there's been a progression of documentation, executive orders over several administrations that get a little further along each time. So when you go back to Presidential Policy Directive 20 under the Obama administration, it outlines some defining terms like malicious cyber activity. Okay, we can understand that. That's useful. We don't just call everything a cyber attack. We really define something particular that can impact an organization. And then come forward a few administrations, and now we have the executive order that specifies zero trust architecture. Now people, I think, that I've talked to have that interest of, okay, I should probably learn what this means. And then I can go to documents like the NIST document that Don talked about. It is a pretty easy read in general to where, okay, this makes sense. I can take the average person and get them to understand it. Now, I'm not going to get the average worker who has nothing to do in IT to read that, but at least they understand that this is just part of the current method of how we do things. Oh, do you want there to be a remote teleworking option for your employment? Well, you need to understand what risks come with that and what you have to take on as a burden as a person to ask for those sorts of things. So I think that's some aspects of it.
Okay, Steve?
Yeah, I will echo absolutely everything Ian just said. And I'll add two things. I'll start with, cultural change is a topic of discussion at the leadership level. And I like to say, I forget exactly where I heard this, but what interests my boss fascinates me. And when you're trying to make cultural change from a top down, it really comes down to the proof that the boss takes this seriously being the impetus behind the shift for the employees. I'll work for a battalion commander who has a heavy emphasis on some topic. It doesn't really matter what that topic is. Well, the organization will change that battalion until the next battalion commander comes in. If you really want across the DoD, that's heavier. And what that means is that if you're going to make the decision that this is a high priority, that means it has to be a high priority that takes the place of other high priorities. How much pain are you willing to inflict on your employees in order to get the message across that we're taking this seriously? Okay, we take phishing seriously. Well, that's belied by the fact that the training that we receive as employees is an online class that we take on an annual basis that I can just click through. Right? That's not taking it seriously. Taking it seriously is what the superintendent did the first year I was here and shut down school to have a talk across the entire Corps of Cadets at West Point about sexual assault and harassment. He shut down school. That is taking it seriously, because you are now interrupting everyone else's day and thought process in order to insert what you are dictating to be a high priority. And I think that one of the biggest issues with regard to phishing, which you specifically referenced, Joyce, is we have not been willing to inflict pain as an organization in order to get the point across that this is something to be taken seriously. One of the reasons, phishing is a fun example because 96% of employees don't click on the link. 96%, that's the statistic generally. On average, when you have a phishing campaign, it's a 96% failure rate on your attempt to phish, which means it's a 4% success rate, and you only need one.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So
Yeah.
there are technological solutions, which Ian mentioned, but the leadership impetus really is going to be critical for that cultural change. And the second piece of this, and the reason I bring this up second, is the education of the workforce has to be just beyond that phishing is a threat. We have to be able to articulate the ways in which our interaction with the technology of our organization, that we are a potential threat vector. And that has to begin. I'm using the Army or the DoD as the example. Cyberspace is a real space. It's abstract, but we interact with it, and it is a domain of warfare now. But how many officers and enlisted outside of the cyber branch can read a network map? I can read a land navigation map because it's a high priority for all officers and enlisted to be able to navigate on terrain. But how many can navigate the digital terrain and be able to understand the ways in which the digital tools coincide with the conventional and physical tools? So the leadership emphasis, it goes both in terms of where are you assigning your priorities, but it also goes into how are you making those priorities both in operations and in training and education, so that it is a high point of emphasis for the entire workforce across the organization.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve.
Joyce, could I weigh in on this?
Absolutely.
Sure. Well, I think when I got my certification as a Forrester Zero Trust strategist, I was rather surprised to find that about 70% of it was about change management and around culture, which is what you're talking about. And I think in getting leadership to buy in, I think it's important to understand that it's more than just educating the workforce, and it's more than just the phishing. For instance, each one of the technological changes that are inherent in Zero Trust are likely to carry some sort of cultural impact. For instance, least privilege. We all know about this, but under Zero Trust, you're going to implement it and enforce it more strictly. Well, that means often taking privileges away from people. Usually they're privileges they don't need, but there's a status associated with having certain privileges. That's going to be a cultural change that's hard to implement. That's one of the pain points that Steve was talking about. We talk about Zero Trust also involves, a lot more encryption of traffic and encryption in place. Well, encryption can carry with it some performance degradation. How much performance degradation are your users willing to tolerate? We talk about visibility and knowing where the data is. Well, that often will require more stringent classification and marking of data, and also knowing which data goes where, and maybe some data doesn't need to go to certain places and organizing that, but we have people that are used to data going across, from point A to point B. I remember at one agency, we analyzed very carefully where the data was going and discovered that actually, and I'm not joking, went around in a circle and trying to convince people that this A was true and B needed to be fixed was quite a cultural exercise. In addition, implementing your contracting staff and the government staff might both be equipped with skill sets around certain technologies, some of which might be committed or you might be committed to in a contract. Well, if you need to change technologies or update that, there might be contract mods involved, and then you get involved with the whole budgeting thing that Steve was mentioning before. So I think there's this interaction of technology, which implementing new technologies or more strictly enforcing existing technologies can carry with it cultural changes that can be difficult and painful to endure. So
okay, thank you.
That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right, thank you very much. Reggie, are there tools or best practices over and above the NIST guidelines to guide zero trust strategy and execution?
Yeah, look, I think that there are a number of tools that many organizations should be implementing today. Question is, whether they are, that I think are additive and that are, sort of in line with, zero trust. I mean, many organizations, for example, have implemented, identity management infrastructure, and they've implemented, multi-factor authentication with certificates and so forth. I mean, all of those are, elements of, a perfected sort of zero trust model. And I'll come back to the point that I made earlier. I mean, a lot of the elements of this are not sort of brand new. A lot of the elements of this are things that we kind of sort of know and kind of sort of have done and are doing. But I think we're going to need to do a lot more of it. There's going to need to be a lot more of it, a lot closer to the data resources. And there, again, is some core foundational stuff that's easier said than done, and tools that are out there that are readily available, and sort of, policy, audit, compliance, identity, knowing what you have, situational awareness, mapping, but got to do it, and you've got to do it day in and day out. And increasingly, you can't have these tools or systems be isolated either. They have to be able to communicate with one another, so that you're sharing information in between what today might be sort of disparate kinds of entities. That's what I really see a lot of, zero trust is pulling together a lot of the learnings, a lot of individual silos of security that we have had, and, creating a model that can be successfully implemented.
Well, this question is for all of you. Going on what Reggie just said, a lot of people think that this is unrealistic, that this just won't happen. It can't happen. It shouldn't happen. What are your thoughts and how would you answer the skeptics? I'm going to start with Ian.
I think the sophistication of the threat is where I like to start, and it's not just the nation state adversaries, though we understand that that is one of the real sophisticated threats. And I think that was really broadcast to the public back in 2013 or around then when kind of we talked about the Advanced Persistent Threat 1, APT1. There's a fantastic report that really outlines the depth of effort put in by nation states that are not just going after their adversarial militaries, they're going after sectors of critical infrastructure, they're going after education, they're going after intellectual property across the corporate world. And they have a lot of resources to devote. But we're also seeing the criminal groups and the other non-state actors take a business approach to how they attack. They have a strategy. They're not just going after low-lying fruit because they're looking at their strategies and they're implementing and they're seeing, hey, I can probably come up with something, spread it across, and I can ask for several $1 million at a time. So I think it goes back to, again, when we talk about the architecture and the mindset initially, it's just a necessary advancement of strategy to protect our networks, knowing that there's a competition with that advanced threat. So why wouldn't we meet that challenge? It seems unnecessary to just accept that we can't be good at cyber defense. And I talk to new classes of officers often, and I always start out the question when we talk about defensive cyberspace operations. Hey, do you think we're any good? Usually the answer is people just generally take it as no, we're not good. And so remind them, yeah, we are. We put some really strong minds at this problem because there's benefit to it. It makes sense that we would, and we are coming up with answers. answers. And so I would say this is a good, strong answer. And it goes back to, we can read good publications about it and talk to other people in the industry and see that there is a well thought out strategy of zero trust architecture. If someone has something better to offer, great. But for right now, I read a lot of good things about this.
Thank you, Ian. Steve, how would you answer the skeptics?
Well, I'd start by saying it exists. You want to go and read some pretty informative papers. The Forrester paper in 2010 that kind of repopularized the name zero trust referenced back in 2010 places where it had already been implemented. The Google Beyond Corp has some really good, short, easy to follow papers. I think there's 6 of them that outline precisely how they did it. And they did it back in 2009 and published papers in 2014 talking about how they did it, what obstacles that they ran into. So to say it is unrealistic is simply belied by the reality of places where it's being done. The second thing that I would say is, in terms of unrealistic, it's the zero trust architecture is a reflection of the needs of the modern day, theorized in advance, and some of the basic principles put forward as far back as the mid 90s. And so to say that zero trust, the idea of limiting the scope and scale of who has access to what at what times to constantly monitor those access requests and protect the data, that's simply reflective of the modern environment. And I'll echo what Ian said. If you got something better, great. But until then, this is not only the modern solution for the modern problem, but it's also going to be the start point for anything coming later. As security advances, the adversary will advance to meet the threat. That's why there's never going to be a silver bullet. It's always going to be a cat and mouse. But this is going to be the network that enables a lot of that operation side, the mobile workforce, the monitoring at the resource level, protecting the data, which is really the important piece of this. So I'd answer the skeptics by saying it's out there, and what that question says really is, I don't understand the environment. And because I don't understand the environment that currently exists, because zero trust, we've talked a lot today about technologies. We've talked a lot about culture. We've talked a lot about leadership, the workforce, the things that a zero trust network and the different pieces of it will enable. We've talked a lot about those things. But what zero trust really is, and I'll bring it back to the first question you asked, Joyce, is it's a mindset.
Yeah.
And your technology, your culture, your policy, your leadership, and your workforce have to reflect the mindset of you get what you need to do your job, no more than what you need to do your job, and you are prohibited from accessing things that you don't have the need for. And this is just the modern implementation of that. So to say that zero trust as a mindset is unrealistic, or to say that the technological solutions are unrealistic, are belied both by the fact that they do exist and that the mindset is reflective of the current environment. And so to say it's unrealistic simply says, I don't understand what the real world is.
Good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about, the mindset that says it's not real is because they really don't understand, the whole concept behind it and how it affects their organization. Reggie, why don't we ask you the same question?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think a lot of great things have been said about, how to deal with skeptics. I mean, interesting thing I found about skeptics is that they don't build an awful lot, but they can cause a lot of paralysis within an organization. And so I'd say that to the advocates and to the sponsors who are looking to, implement this mindset within their organization, you want to avoid the boil the ocean scenarios, and you want to avoid the, sort of big bangs. You want to focus in demonstrating zero trust paradigms, zero trust principles in a controlled an area of your infrastructure, and get what I call base hits. Just get some singles and doubles. Let's show some success. Let's prove that success. Let's get some training. And then in doing that, it becomes to get more generative, and you get more buy-in that, yeah, we've done that over there. It worked over there. Now we can go let their same concepts spread through other places throughout the organization. That would be how I would recommend that we deal with the skeptics.
Okay, and Don.
Yeah, well, I mean, Steve stole my thunder. I was going to bring up Britain. Will be on for us. So darn it. I hate these people that know stuff. So yeah, I mean, there are real world implementations out there for sure, and they work. But I would say the biggest thing is, okay, if implementing zero trust is not realistic, is it realistic to stick with what we have? Because it's not going in the right direction. I mean, it's just not realistic to think that we can continue to do what we're doing and have any success in protecting ourselves. Between SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, OPM, heck, I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, it's just not realistic to think that we can continue business as usual and feel that we're succeeding in protecting our nation's infrastructure and data. So I would say that's how one of many ways to answer the skeptics, and also to point to the real world implementations. This is not just pie in the sky stuff. And also, I see a real tsunami of information and a lot of impetus behind this whole effort. I mean, we've got the executive order, you've got DoD's reference architecture, you've got the NIST document, you've got commercial world stuff, you've got the recently published OMB and CISA stuff, you've got an SSA document. I mean, I think it's really happening. It's really pushing. But I agree wholeheartedly with Reggie. If it's presented as a boil of the ocean scenario, then you are going to get eye rolls like, oh, this will never happen. If you take a phased approach and take a little baby steps that work and are demonstrable, you're going to have a lot more success, particularly when it comes to the cultural change issues that we were talking about before. If you have to change an entire culture from the ground up, yeah, that might be unrealistic. But if you can make headway in one area and show the benefit to the organization as a whole, then I think you can start to really get some traction on what is honestly a large scale effort. I mean, it's going to take a while. We have one partner that's a mid-sized company. Took 4 years to get their zero trust implementation off the ground. And it's not complete. It'll never be complete. It's just an ongoing state. So anyway, we're 3 minutes away, so I better be quiet.
Thanks so much, Don, and I agree with all of you. It's an incremental approach. The old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Bottom line, as with all security and IT projects, find an easy early win. Actually, when I went to Dubai, I had some camel, so one bite at a time. Start your zero trust journey with a specific use case, app, or user population, small bites at a time. That way you can show success, and you can show that the resources as far as people and money is being well spent. And you can make your internal selling so much easier and prove out any new architectures or technologies. The discussions from our panelists should help you. But remember, as many other things worthwhile, they don't happen overnight. This is the same with building a zero trust security model. It is a journey, not a sprint. Again, thanks so much to our panelists, Ian Simon, Steve Whitham, Reggie Best, and Don McLean, and you, our audience. For additional information about ICIT and future briefings, please go to www.icitech.org. Gentlemen, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And scene. Right?